My name is Suzanne Bocanegra. I'm an artist and I live in New York. This is a lecture about a 16th century tapestry in the collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It came about because the performance curator at the Met asked me to make a lecture about a piece of art in their collection, and I chose this. It's a tapestry. It's one of the largest in the collection at the Met, 19 by 25 feet. It's projected here almost life-size. The screen isn't quite big enough. It was woven over a period of years between 1520 and 1532, kind of the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance. The title of the tapestry is Honor. The lecture will be performed by the actor Lili Taylor as me. I'll be reading my lecture at this table on stage right into this microphone. My voice will go into a little speaker in Lili's ear. Lili will repeat the text she hears, and I'll let her know when to switch slides. I've always had a good feeling about tapestries. I think it's just the word tapestry. It's such a handy metaphor for lots of things coming together to make one big thing. It's the go-to word for harmoniously mingling things that don't necessarily get along. People talk about the tapestry of life a lot. It's such a reassuring way to look at our existential situation. Calling something a tapestry makes it feel like it all makes sense and adds up to something. A tapestry of anything really always sounds like a good thing in a vague sort of way. Not unlike the word honor. This is the man who owned the Honor tapestry, Erard de la Marck. He was a Catholic cardinal and the Prince of Liège in what is now Belgium. It was hard to find a whole lot out about him. I found this photo of his sleeve on a state-run database of Belgian art. They opened his casket for some reason in the 19th century and photographed bits of his clothes. This is his shoe. I really love these old photos of old textiles, tattered scraps of extravagant garments. The Rati textile collection at the Met has a lot of these photos too. I love the burlap background on this one. I ended up going to Liège. I found a few more portraits. I found out Erard de la Marck started the coal industry in Liège and died of food poisoning. I found this quirky armoire he owned in the city museum. Liège also has this really nice Calatrava train station that sort of looks like Erard de la Marck's hat. So, Erard de la Marck's Honor tapestry was actually based on this tapestry, also titled Honor. Owned by the man he served as a sort of lobbyist and fundraiser, the most powerful man in Europe, Charles V. Here he is with his dog. Charles ruled all of this. Spain and what we now call the Netherlands, much of Germany, parts of Italy, the Philippines, and huge portions of the Western Hemisphere. And he ruled it for 40 years. He also bribed his way into becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. That's how you did it, with bribes. You didn't even have to be discreet about it. Erard de la Marck helped with that. Quite honestly, I had no clue who Charles V was when I started this. I found most Americans usually just know his contemporary, Henry VIII, who by comparison only ruled this. Maybe it's his exciting personal life. People love that. Charles's marital life was dull by comparison. He was a super devout Catholic and married only once, a strategic arranged marriage to his cousin Isabel, and he was okay with that. He even seemed to love his wife. He had illegitimate children here and there, but that was to be expected. It could also be we know Henry VIII for the simple reason that he's from an English-speaking country. I was talking to a friend from Mexico who said he didn't know who Henry VIII was until he moved to the States. But growing up in Mexico, Carlos V candy bar were his favorite. Now, this is Charles's honor tapestry. It's way bigger and has way more figures and detail than Gerard's. Here's Gerard's. It's hard to tell how different they are. They're both very Where's Waldo? But just to compare the difference, here's the figure in the middle of the tapestry, the guy keeping track of the honor roll, in Gerard's tapestry. Here's the same figure in Charles's tapestry. It even has a 5 o'clock shadow. Don't get me wrong, Gerard's tapestry is plenty impressive, really amazing. But Charles's tapestry are so detailed, they actually include portraits of people in his court. Here's Gerard de la Marque. There are 69 characters woven into the honor tapestry. Most of them are labeled. We wouldn't know who they are otherwise. They're all arranged in rows, kind of like a chart. Honorable men are on the top row. The honorable women are in the middle. On the bottom is a co-ed row of dishonorable men and women. It reminded me of the standard template of a self-help book, with the characters offering their life story as examples of honor to be imitated or dishonor to be avoided. In tapestry, the aesthetic was more is always more. I've always been attracted to dense, crowded pictures. I like things that are visually thick. There's no way you can take it all in just one moment. And I find that reassuring somehow. I've always found a kind of security in knowing there's plenty to look at. I like libraries for the same reason. You'll never run out of things to think about. New York City feels that way to me too. Everyone crammed together, you'll never get to know everyone. I'll never even get to know all the people on my block. When my kids were little, I had this book with images of Juan Bruegel's overstuffed flower paintings. I used to look at those images and just get lost. One night, I woke up, got out of bed, and opened the book and just started painting one of the petals. After that, whenever I had a moment, I would paint more. I ended up painting every single petal. After I painted every petal, I pinned them on the wall in the same composition as the original painting. I worked on it for months, and then I did another one, and another, and another. I did all the petals in this painting, also by Bruegel, titled Sense of Smell. My time was always so broken up when I had children to look after, and for some reason, I found intense observation enormously satisfying. The honor tapestry rewards the same kind of close looking. The individual stitches are meant to come together as a picture when viewed at a distance. But when you study them up close, you can really see the skill of the weaver cutting in colors to make the shading. The weavers would sometimes put slits in the tapestry to emphasize a line. You can see that here in the mouth. This guy has really great teeth. The image is structured on the grid of a loom, which gives it an odd look, but which also gives it a strange kind of beauty. Nothing said I'm incredibly powerful and filthy rich quite like a tapestry. It was the most expensive artwork money could buy, and the expense was kind of the point. It took years for workshops of highly skilled weavers to make these things on giant looms, wrapping the horizontal weft threads around the stiff vertical warps. A painting of the image that was to be woven, called a cartoon, would be attached to the back of the warp threads. You can see the painting behind this weaver's warp threads. The weaver looks through the warp threads to the picture behind it, and then interprets what they see with colored wool or silk, or sometime in the 16th century, gold threads. Here's a cartoon for a tapestry by Raphael that somehow survived. Most didn't. They weren't meant to. In the 16th century, tapestry was valued way over painting or sculpture. Now we look at art as a product of an artist's vision, their inner life. But in the Renaissance, art patrons weren't interested in an artist's inner life. The artist's vision was in service of the craft. This is a painting of Charles V by Bernard van Orley. Van Orley is the artist who most likely designed the cartoon for the honor tapestry. Germanic artists in the north didn't seem to be shy about painting the famous Habsburg chin that ran in Charles's family. Supposedly, Charles couldn't even close his mouth, and it was difficult for him to make himself understood. The Italian painter Titian never painted it. Charles loved Titian. These tapestries were filled with complicated, erudite messages, and those messages would have been devised for the artist by a scholar. Most likely, it would have been Juan Luis Vives, a Spanish humanist who for a time was in the court of Catherine of Aragon until Henry VIII divorced her to marry Anne Boleyn and consequently outlawed the Catholic Church, a bold move no one saw coming. Besides advertising personal wealth and power and a claim to high ideals and virtues like honor, tapestries were great for traveling. Just roll it up and unfurl it at your destination. Instant interior decoration that also provided insulation from the damp and helped absorb that echoey castle sound. And rulers, princes, emperors, they were all big travelers because they were always at war. War was a big part of a 16th century ruler's day-to-day. Europe was a jumble of kingdoms, fiefdoms, towns, cities, principalities that were constantly changing hands. Charles spent his life crisscrossing Europe, fighting for some parcel of land he was convinced should rightly be his. It was all about his honor. And these wars were hugely expensive. Charles bankrupted the enormous Spanish treasury going to war. It never seemed to occur to Charles that marching off to war might be more trouble than it was worth. Besides the expense, there was also all that human misery, death, and destruction. Here's an expensive tapestry, also by Bernard van Orley, depicting the Battle of Pavia, one of Charles's expensive wars he was particularly proud of. It looks like Crazy Town. The people woven into the tapestry illustrate the standard of Charles's and Erard's honor group, the honor group of the aristocracy in Europe in the 16th century. For men, it's usually about violence, your prowess as a warrior. For women, it's usually about sexual purity. I pledged on my honor all the time in the Girl Scouts, and I never really thought about it. I've always just assumed honor was pretty much a good thing, big with the military, but I've since found out it's not necessarily a good thing, or ethical, or moral. Honor is esteem and recognition. It's respect. And that esteem and recognition depends on the judgment of others, on the values of the group you belong to, on the honor code of your honor group. And those values, those codes, can be all over the place. One group's morality is another group's immorality. I'm still trying to figure this all out. I thought honor, the concept of honor, would be the least interesting thing about this tapestry. I was wrong about that. Every single book I've read about honor explains honor with stories, like a tapestry. I think that's because it's the only way, because honor is an abstraction. Now, honor was part of a set of 7 tapestries. There's also prudence, virtue, faith, justice. Fortune and fame have been lost. When you hung all the tapestries together, they mimicked a spectacular state-sponsored theatrical show of power everyone in the court would have been familiar with, the Joyous entry. Once a fiefdom or city or principality was in your power, through a dynastic marriage, an unexpected death, maybe a war, an impressive theatrical event, a joyous entry, was staged for a monarch's first official visit to the town. It was actually 2 simultaneous spectacles with the ruler and the townspeople performing for each other. The monarch would enter the town in an elaborately planned and costumed procession. Meanwhile, the town would be turned into a giant theater for the procession's viewing pleasure. A temporary arch would be built just for the procession to enter the city. Temporary sculptures would be erected, and temporary pavilions would be built all over the town. The pavilions would hold tableaux vivants, a silent, motionless group of townspeople costumed and arranged to create a stage picture. The imagery in those tableaux vivants would be designed to flatter the ruler, and sometimes the townspeople used their tableaux to suggest in the most subtle way possible virtues they hoped the new ruler would embody. As the procession snaked through the city, the monarch would pause to view the pavilions along the way. The structure of the honor tapestry, with its row of figures form a shallow stage, is modeled after those tableaux vivants stages. Towns would often go into debt mounting these productions. Sometimes the town had to do another one a few months later when someone else came to power. Joyous entries were designed and planned by the best artists: Titian, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. They all designed joyous entries. It was said that Leonardo da Vinci's best work was done for joyous entries. But since it was temporary and undocumented, it's hard to know, which is always a problem with live theater. Souvenir programs called festival books would sometimes be published to memorialize the event, which is pretty much the only visual record we have. Actually, these images are from a festival book of Charles's grandfather, Maximilian, of a joyous entry that never happened. They remind me so much of these Mardi Gras souvenir programs. I love the idea of tableau vivant. Years ago, in an airline magazine, I saw a photo of couples posing in Meissen ceramics in a tableau vivant show. I wanted to go ever since. I saved the page. The show is called The Pageant of the Masters. It's an outdoor stage show in Laguna Beach in Southern California. Each act begins with a giant projection of a work of art on a scrim. Unless you know the original, it's impossible to be impressed by the live copy. Then the lights go up on the tableau vivant behind the scrim and reveal the real live tableau. The audience is to marvel at the similarities between the video projection of the work of art and the imitation. They keep it all as flat as possible, squishing the 3D people into a 2D space. Like the Joyous entries, hundreds of local townspeople volunteer to be painted and costumed and stand still. Except in Laguna Beach, it's 6 shows a week, all summer long, and they only have to be still for 90 seconds. The show has incredible high production values. The stagecraft, the makeup, the lighting design, it's all first rate, even a live orchestra. It's gee whiz at a very high level. I finally went with my friend Josephine, who knew to bring binoculars. Binoculars are essential to determine whether people are posing absolutely still and whether you're looking at real flesh or a body stocking. Actually, sculpture and decorative arts are definitely the most successful, maybe because it's already 3-dimensional figures standing still. They're also usually just one color, so it's easy to get that right. People go to museums to see the real thing, the authentic object. But you come here to see the fakes. But it has a strange claim to authenticity because the real flesh and blood people portray the fake people in the artwork. So it sort of casts the original artwork as a fake. It's this back and forth that's just really weird. Every year the show ends with the tableau of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. In spite of the recording begging the audience to stay until the end, a lot of the audience left. They'd seen it before. Another kind of political theater in the 16th century that was meant to impress your subjects was the public execution. But unlike the Joyous entry, which was all about honor, the public execution was all about shame. The most elaborate, with the highest production values, was the Spanish Inquisition's auto de fe. Charles's grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, the Ferdinand and Isabella that bankrolled Columbus, came up with the idea. Charles thought the Inquisition was a brilliant idea, so he kept it going. The Inquisition most often went after Jews, Muslims, and heretics, which would mean anyone suspected of converting to the new Protestant religions. Trials were conducted in secret, and your accuser was anonymous. Confessions were obtained by torture, and the accused was presumed guilty until proved otherwise. The auto de fe was structured a lot like a Joyous entry. The convicted were costumed in a kind of tunic called the San Benito and organized into a parade through the streets. There was a hierarchy. First, there were those who got off light. They just had to perform penance. Maybe they had to wear the San Benito for a year. Next were people to be mercifully strangled before being burned alive. The flames on their San Benito pointed down. Next were those to be burned alive, with the flames pointing up. And after that were boxes of bones from the cadavers of people who were tried posthumously. The whole event would last for hours. After the auto de fe, the tunics would be hung up in the executed person's home church as a symbol of their shame. Juan Luis Vives, the Catholic humanist I mentioned before, was from a prosperous family of conversos, Spanish Jews that converted to Catholicism. When Vives was 14, his father was accused by the Inquisition of practicing Judaism in secret. He was burned at the stake. His mother died of the plague, but she was also accused of practicing Judaism in secret, and her bones were burned in an auto da fe, which seemed pretty pointless, but they did that all the time in the Inquisition. There were also more humble executions, but also public. The only prisons to speak of in the 16th century were holding pens, a place to wait until public punishment could be performed. Modern prisons, as we know them today, actually took an optimistic view of human nature, based on the assumption that wrongdoers could reform. They didn't think that way in the 16th century. One executioner, Franz Schmidt, kept a diary. He explains how beheading took a lot of skill and how he mastered it by practicing on stray animals. Schmidt performed all kinds of executions, and all these executions took place in front of a crowd, there to witness the improvised public performance of the victim. A repentant victim begging for forgiveness was the performance they were looking for. The performance would always include a procession to the place of execution, and along the way, Schmidt would tear off skin with hot pincers. Schmidt acted not only as a performer in this drama, but also as the director, handling the hysterical victim, as well as an often unruly crowd. Schmidt also handled all the public punishments, floggings, cutting off fingers and ears, tongues, and torture in order to extract confessions. Franz Schmidt's least favorite execution, reserved exclusively for women, was drowning. He hated it because it was hard to control. The women kept popping up. Schmidt convinced the authorities into letting him behead women condemned to be drowning instead. The authorities agreed, reasoning that a beheading was a much more dramatic performance. You couldn't see much when the victim was underwater, and there would also be a severed head to tack up somewhere. The dead, often mutilated bodies and various body parts were always displayed. It was educational. I grew up Catholic. That's actually a picture of my church. I spent my life praying to a life-size, realistic representation of an executed, tortured body, and I never really thought much about it. It was just a crucifix. For me, it was divorced from history. Honestly, I still can't see this as a tortured body. But this I can, or this. Executioners were also skilled in keeping people alive after torture, so they could be killed in public. So by default, they knew human anatomy and often became the town medical examiner. Suzanne needs a drink of water. I'll take a drink as well. Okay. Not that there was much anyone could do for anyone, really. Life in the 16th century was hard. This is Peter Bruegel the Elder painting The Triumph of Death. He was the father of Jan Bruegel, who did all the flowers. The painting covers all the popular ways to die in the 16th century. My sister and I worked this jigsaw puzzle when the pandemic started. Executions are on the upper right. A newborn had a 50-50 chance of reaching their 12th birthday. 1 in 20 women died within 7 weeks of delivery, and in some areas, 2/3 of the population would die from plague. And it was a painful, agonizing death. There was no morphine. There's a famous tableau vivant that's still performed every 10 years in Oberammergau, Germany, fulfilling a vow made by the townspeople to perform the Passion Play in perpetuity to be spared the plague. The plays are controversial. For years, they blamed it all on the Jews. They finally toned down the anti-Semitic thing in 2010. Besides fear of disease, there was fear of famine. Harvest depended on so many unpredictable variables. Maybe you'd have a good harvest, but then you'd be pillaged by an army of hungry soldiers passing through. 15 to 20% of the population were always hungry. And in wartime, that could go up to 60%. That's why there were so many fairy tales about eating people. It happened. These were my favorite dolls growing up. I first saw them in the Sears catalog and begged for them for Christmas. I never changed their clothes. They were too special. I was all in with the dirtles and the lederhosen. My Hansel and Gretel book was also one of my favorites. I thought a house made of candy was an incredible idea. But actually, Hansel and Gretel is a gruesome story about starvation and killing your children in order to survive. In the story, there's a famine. A father and his new wife decide to kill his 2 children. Given the prevalence of child mortality and the likelihood of children surviving at all with dead parents, it's not really an irrational decision. The plan was to kill his 2 children by losing them in the woods, which I guess is better than being murdered in cold blood. Once they're truly lost in the woods, Hansel and Gretel miraculously discover the house made of candy. The evil witch who conjured the house is hungry. She traps the children in order to eat them. Have you ever wondered why she could conjure an edible house, but she still had to eat children? Gretel ends up saving the day, pushing the witch into the oven and burning her to death. As a kid, I don't remember the cannibalism or the parents trying to kill their children bothering me much at all. I just lusted after Gretel's outfit and that candy house. The 16th century is famous for witch hunts. People had all kinds of fears about older women living alone. These women became scapegoats, blamed for all kinds of things. A failure to conceive, a stillbirth, crop failure. Sometimes these same women were consulted as healers. And sometimes these women became scary witches. People had all kinds of ideas about witches. They got those ideas from a hugely popular book, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, the most popular book after the Bible in the 16th century. These women were horribly tortured, confessing to all kinds of impossible things, and then executed as witches, burned at the stake, or hung by the neck. And these women were usually poor. In peasant communities, there had always been an ethic of neighborly charity. But in the 16th century, people started making a distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. Poverty became shameful, a sign of sinfulness. And these women were mostly old. As menopause brought an end to childbearing years, there was a profound loss of status. And it wasn't unusual for women in their middle years to be widowed, left impoverished, a burden on families and communities. We still kind of think that way. I found my Old Maid card game in my mom's house. The Old Maid is the only card that has no pair. If you're stuck with the Old Maid card at the end of the game, you lose. An old maid is sometimes called a spinster, one who spins. Textiles and textile paraphernalia are actually loaded imagery women have been using for centuries, a symbol of the ideal homemaker, a domestic industrious woman. Spinning wheels and looms are such physically beautiful tools, and they occupy a huge part of our cultural imagination, considering they've been obsolete for hundreds of years. They take you straight into a romantic rural utopia. These photos are of Welsh women in the 19th century. These hats are amazing. Even more ancient than the spinning wheel is the distaff. This is a 16th century woman with a distaff and a hat made of spools. I've always been drawn to spinning wheels and looms and the idea of weaving of any sort, the accessories of a domestic sainthood. I went away to do a Swedish weaving workshop once. That's when I realized I just like to be in the room with all the weaving paraphernalia, but I didn't like to do the actual weaving. I do like to draw though, so I tried to see if I could come up with some sort of weaving equivalent with drawing. I've always admired Bauhaus weaver Annie Alver's work. I found this simple weaving she did in 1924 in a book. I drew it over and over and glued all my drawings to large canvases. I made them complicated and busy, like Renaissance tapestries. There are exceptions, but historically, men weave for profit. The men who wove the honor tapestry were paid professionals working in strictly regulated craft guilds. It was illegal for women to belong to the guild. Women weaved cloth at home for their family's use, unpaid. And women do the spinning. Men rarely spin, except for Gandhi, who was making a point about humility. And of course, Rumpelstiltskin. Two of the figures on the honor tapestry are associated with traditional women's labor, with textiles. In the row of honorable women is Penelope, who wove and unraveled her husband's burial shroud every night as a way of being faithful to him. In the dishonorable section is a man, Serendopoulos, accused of spinning with the women rather than going to war to defend his country. He's shown with a distaff. Textile work is honorable for Penelope, but a mark of shame for Serendopoulos. My mom always tried to get me to take home ec in high school, but I would always tell her I had no plans to be a stay-at-home housewife, which was an awkward declaration, seeing that my mom was a stay-at-home housewife. Years later, when I was wandering around the library, I found a book on the history of home economics. It was created by Ellen Swallow Richards, a chemist specializing in sanitation, and the first woman to graduate from MIT. Home economics was Richards' attempt to bring honor to the work that women did in the home. She theorized that by applying scientific methods to housework, it would be respected and valued. But no one ever seemed to question whether housework was exclusively women's work. I think my generally positive feelings for tapestry also come from this. In 1971, Carole King's Tapestry album came out. I love the photos people take of this album for eBay. They're little domestic still lives that can give you a sense of how these objects live in people's homes. This one just has her foot with a weird stain. This one's lying on the bed. Oh, that laptop wouldn't be in a photo from 1971. 1971 was the age of hippies and communes and back to the land, an earnest revival of the handmade. Carole King, a hugely successful songwriting prodigy who sold her first album in Manhattan's famous Brill Building when she was just 16, portrays herself on the album as a woman at home, working on a textile. The physical labor that craft requires was seen as a critique of the post-war glorification of mass production. Making by hand was virtuous and honorable. It was embraced as an almost spiritual practice. On college campuses in the 50s, weaving would have been taught in the home ec department as part of textile science. But in the 70s, it had moved to the fine art department. This is Magdalene Abramowicz's with some of her woven sculptures. This is Beryl Karot's video installation, Text and Commentary. The word text and textile have the same root, texere, to weave. Crafts that had been long forgotten were revived with sincere devotion to technique and skill. But somewhere along the way, craftsmanship morphed into crafting. Giant craft stores opened, supplying all the cheap factory-made crap we require to have the pleasure of making things by hand. That's when pipe cleaners became chenille stems. Companies began to market DIY kits. I got a kit for a crochet vest one Christmas. My mom ended up finishing it. I remember my mom asking why I never wore it after all the work she put into it. I got an Afghan kit too. My Aunt Frances finished that one. The tapestry Carole King is making on her Tapestry album wasn't actually a tapestry. It was needlepoint, a kind of embroidery with yarn that became popular in the 70s. You bought a pre-printed canvas like this, or you could just buy a DIY kit. The title song on King's album, Tapestry, begins with that classic metaphor, life is a tapestry, and moves on to a faux Renaissance tale about a toad. The European Renaissance was something on everyone's mind in the 70s. It was big in pop culture. In 1963, school teacher Phyllis Patterson created a Renaissance fair in her backyard to teach history to kids. That same year, Patterson and her husband Ron created a larger version of the fair as a fundraiser for Pacifica radio station. Along the way, Patterson's backyard history lesson for kids morphed into an irreverent experiment into historical reenactment and environmental theater. It was an instant success. When you're anxious about the future, and in the 60s and 70s, everyone was, the past can be reassuring and you can remember it however you want. The Pattersons hired actors, costume and period attire to perform as European royalty. Salt of the earth peasants, acrobatic beggars, and even convicted criminals. The Pattersons sought out early music performers for the fair. Early music in the 60s was gaining popularity, a challenge to the tyranny of European romantic and classical musical culture. Musicians could go back in time before the rules were set. The audience was encouraged to dress in improvised, homemade Renaissance costumes and interact directly with the actors. For many fairgoers, dressing up could be liberating, an opportunity to sample unconventional styles of self-presentation under the umbrella of the historical reenactment. The Pattersons were influenced by avant-garde theater artists in the 60s. People who were questioning theatrical conventions and eliminating the boundaries between the audience's space and the actor's space. Artists who were questioning the very nature of performing. What is an identity performed? What is authentic? Can artifice be true? Those egalitarian approaches to theater were embraced by the Renaissance Fair as they recreated the rigid social hierarchies of the very unegalitarian world of 16th century Europe. Rock concerts were also experimenting with new forms of presentation, like week-long outdoor festivals, that also encouraged audience participation and unconventional self-presentation. Renaissance fair and rock fashion began to cross-pollinate and made its way to the suburbs. That's when vintage clothing stores started opening. We all started going to Goodwill and wearing old clothes. My mother was horrified and made sure I washed everything twice. I make costumes for theater. I never realized until now how much my aesthetic owes to the Renaissance Fair's wacky, cobbled-together aesthetic. That's Lily in one of mine. Here's another. Over the decades, the fair shifted from experimental happenings to lucrative commercial entertainment and popular wedding package, welcoming all fantasies, however vaguely adjacent to 16th century Europe. Carole King is photographed here in her home in Laurel Canyon, a bohemian neighborhood of artists and musicians in Los Angeles. In the 60s and 70s, lots of other musicians, like Frank Zappa, Jackson Browne, and Joni Mitchell, lived there too. Her Ladies of the Canyon album is all about Laurel Canyon. All these musicians were beginning to have a lot of success as singer-songwriters. The Monkees lived in Laurel Canyon too. They were in an imaginary rock band made for television show, modeled after the Beatles. Two actors, Mickey Dolenz and Davy Jones, who had both been child stars, and two musicians, Peter Tork and Michael Nesmith, who were already singer-songwriters, were cast as the band members. The Monkees were assembled by management. They didn't choose their music or play their instruments on the albums. They were part of a corporate marketing template that was packaging the counterculture, monetizing it, and making it safe for 9-year-olds like me. And it worked. I loved the Monkees, and I begged my dad to let me watch them every week. For the two musicians, Peter Tork and Michael Nesmith, all of this was hard to live down. It's kind of humiliating for a serious musician to be in a fake band. But Mickey and Davy were actors, speaking lines that someone else wrote. Pretending you're someone that you're not is what an actor does. Mickey Dolenz was no more a drummer in a rock band than I am an actor on this stage. But if you believed his performance, then it was a job well done. With honor, context is everything. The New York Philharmonic musicians are assembled by management too, and they have no say in the repertoire, and yet we have tremendous respect for them. But it's a different honor group. I was in the Girl Scouts for a very long time. My mom was even a leader for a year or two. I had a comic book on the life of Daisy Lowe, the founder of the Girl Scouts. On her wedding day to Willie Lowe, a piece of rice went into her ear and caused permanent deafness. That always stuck with me. That a grain of rice on your wedding could make you deaf. My comic book also almost offhandedly mentions that when her husband died, she was heartbroken. But actually, Daisy Lowe was heartbroken long before Willie Lowe died, humiliated by his very public philandering. In fact, that was that shame that caused Daisy Lowe to reclaim her honor in the form of a very public philanthropic project, the Girl Scouts. For Daisy Lowe, an organization that taught girls to be self-reliant and resourceful, had an enormous appeal. Through the Girl Scouts, Lowe found purpose and was no longer a shamed woman. The Girl Scout uniform borrows its aesthetic from the military. It said that you were not an ornament, you were part of a group, an honor group, and you had things to accomplish and a code to adhere to. Occasionally, famous designers redesigned the leader's outfit, making it less military and a little more airline. And much like every military organization around the world, Girl Scouts earned badges. I was crazy about the badges. They're like little tapestries. Badges and medals have been used to visualize honor in Europe for hundreds of years. The military really has visual honor down. Badges and medals transform your achievements into a wearable visual. These are Soviet medals for motherhood. Medals can really motivate and make you feel like you've accomplished something, even if you didn't. Icons visualizing abstract ideas with people have been used for centuries, often dressed in a particular way and holding particular items. It's a really handy way for artists to get a complicated message across. That's a visual shorthand for an abstract idea. They use them all the time in the Joyous entries. This is a stage with a personification of love. Icons are not always women, but often women, usually in some kind of Roman toga. We still do that. The honor tapestry has quite a few of these figures. There's virtue, victory, majesty, reverence. They're all surrounding one male icon, honor, portrayed as a kind of goofy-looking ruler that sits in judgment of everyone. In the upper left corner are nature blowing a horn, along with dignity and triumph. In the upper right is Scriptura, also blowing a horn. And there's also Asia in the row of honorable women. It's thought that she's actually an icon representing fame. My dad is from Tyler, Texas. And growing up, I was crazy about the annual Tyler Rose Festival. It's a stage show and a parade that's all about icons. Every year, young women from the community portray a different set of themed objects or concepts in costumes that are a cross between Southern Belle and burlesque. Like one year, they were various circus acts. One year, they were things in the sky. These are photos from the grand finale of the stage show, and it looks a little like the honor tapestry. In 2019, I heard that the theme was going to be portraits of inspiration, honoring women who had changed the world. So basically, a real person would be abstracted into a concept personified by a real person. There was no way I was going to miss this. I took my mom. Like the honor tapestry, some of the honored women are fictional. This is Scarlett O'Hara. Some are historical. This is Marie Curie. I guess it's trimmed in radiation. Some were living. This is Jane Goodall. Most of the honored women are movie stars, like Grace Kelly. The costumes don't necessarily make sense. They're supposed to be showstoppers. Liberace said, "Too much is wonderful." Coco Chanel did not. But that idea, this is Georgie O'Keeffe. But the best way to honor someone is to decorate the crap out of a dress. That was also a royal 16th century aesthetic. It's been around. We've been doing that in the Catholic Church for ages. After the show, I chatted with our first female astronaut, Sally Ride. Yeah, that's Sally Ride. I looked at this tapestry a lot, and I always gravitate to the middle, to the row of honorable women. For most of these 10 honorable women, even if they are themselves powerful women, their connection to men is their honor story. This is Judith. Judith seduced the Assyrian general, Holofernes, and chopped off his head. His body is down here in the dishonorable section, in the bottom. His detached head is right beside him. In all of the paintings of Judith and Holofernes, she never breaks a sweat, and it's really hard to cut off a head. She knits her brow a little bit in this one. In this Lucas Cranach painting, the head is kind of a fashion accessory. He did lots of these. They all have great hats. The only painting I found where she really uses some elbow grease is this one. It's by Artemisia Gentileschi, one of the rare women who actually made her living as a painter. Holofernes is a portrait of her art teacher who raped her. She brought him to trial, and he was convicted, and he was banished, but he completely ignored it. She made 2 of these. In one, Judith wears yellow, and in another, she wears blue. This is Semiramis. There are a lot of crazy stories about Semiramis. In one, she marries the king of Assyria and convinced him to give her his power for just 5 days as an experiment. When he agreed, she had him executed and seized the crown. And then she legitimized marriage between parents and children so she could marry her own son and stay in power. There's several operas about her. This is a staging at the Met of one by Rossini. There's also a story that she had sex with her horse, and she was so distraught at his death that she threw herself on his pyre. Semiramis's reputation changed around the time of the tapestry. It changed from dishonorable to honorable. She became admired as a great warrior and city builder. Catholic philosophers decided to give her bestiality and incest a pass. They reasoned that since she was a pagan, she didn't know any better. This is the Queen of Sheba. She's the only one with a bonnet. The Queen of Sheba became famous for traveling 1,400 miles to see if King Solomon was as smart as everyone said he was. She was a black woman from Egypt or maybe Ethiopia. Everyone seems to know that, except every artist who painted her. This is Lucretia. Lucretia was the wife of a Roman soldier. She was raped when he was away from home. Lucretia reported the rape, and then she killed herself. Rape was seen more as an assault on a family's honor than an assault on a woman's body. Here's Lucretia's rapist, Tarquin, in the dishonorable row, pleading to get up to the honorable row. The UN estimates that there are 5,000 women each year killed for their family's honor. There's other easier ways to kill women: denying girls education, forbidding family planning. The Catholic Church forbids the use of condoms, even to prevent AIDS. When I was little, my mom sewed like crazy. Somewhere along the way, my mom started doing less dressmaking and more crafting. She's been making these for years, hand-crocheted pot scrubbers to clean the crud off dishes, scrubbies. Mom made it clear she didn't particularly enjoy making them, but Mom said handmade scrubbies do a better job than anything you can buy off the shelf. Plus, they always sell out at the craft fair at church. I took this video for this piece. I thought it would be useful. My mom died while I was writing this. She fell and hit her head in her house in mid-March, right about the time COVID hit. I had spoken with her the day before. She was worried about what she heard on the news about COVID. I found a note on a scrap of paper on her dining room table that said PPE N95 in her always perfect handwriting. My mom never liked clutter. It bugged her, and she wasn't a saver. She never thought you should hang on to things. But when my sister and I cleaned out her house, we opened a cedar chest, and I found my Hansel and Gretel dolls, the sash from my Girl Scout uniform, and my Daisy Lowe comic book. On the bookshelf, there was only one book from my childhood that she saved, my Hansel and Gretel book. It's really the only one. The illustrations were a little disappointing, not nearly as elaborate and detailed as I remembered. I also found a lot of her handmade scrubbies. We held the funeral in a church, St. Ignatius of Loyola in Spring, Texas, and live-streamed it for relatives. St. Ignatius founded the Jesuit order in Spain during the reign of Charles V. He was actually brought before the Inquisition for his book on spiritual exercises, but he got off. This is the statue of St. Ignatius that's in front of Mom's church. Mom said that when the church installed it, they couldn't decide whether he should be facing in towards the church or facing out to the street, to the people of the community. So they compromised and they had him facing out over the parking lot. In the 16th century, when you were looking at tapestries, you might have heard music. Charles loved music and always traveled with musicians and composers. One of his composers, Matteo Flecca, wrote a song, Rio Rio Chio, about a hungry wolf stuck on the banks of a roaring river, prevented from attacking either the Lamb of God or the Virgin Mary. It's unclear. It might have sounded like this.